Hi everyone! Today's tutorial is for this paper fairy house that I designed to also be a lantern. I've always pictured a magical fairy village where all the houses are hanging from trees, so this is the design I've come up with. This fairy house can stand between 7.5 inches to 8 inches tall, and the reason the height varies is because you can actually make 4 different houses with this one download. Each house is made up of these panels that are put together to create the final house. So if you change the number of panels you use, you can create a different house. For this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to build a 6-panel house like this one. This is the maximum number of panels you can use because I designed the base of the house to come together perfectly with 6 panels. Any more than 6 and you'll have a hole in your base. However, you can use 5, 4, or 3 panels to make your house with no problems. The base will just come together differently for each one, and I'll go over that later. Now, if you're completely confused, don't worry, it'll all make more sense as we go through the tutorial. To light up your house, I would recommend a flameless tea light. For obvious reasons, please don't use a real candle. Even with a flameless tea light, I still get paranoid, so I turn my tea lights off when I'm not in the room. I just want to also mention that there is another version of this fairy house you can make, which is the one you see here on the left. The houses I've shown you so far have tissue paper covering the openings, which is the version I'll be showing you how to make today. However, if you prefer, you can make your house without the tissue paper and it would look like this. Still really cute. It looks a little like a pretty bird cage to me. And here is how it would look as a lantern. It's really neat how the light projects those shapes onto the wall. If you decide to make this version, you can just skip all the tissue paper parts in this video, and the rest of the house will be made the same way as in this tutorial. Alright, let's get started on building our fairy house. Let's first go over what you can expect when you open your Fairy House SVG file. Most of my customers use SVGs. If you're using any of the other file types I included in the folder, it should look the same as this. This is the SVG file from the folder called Fairy House Panels. Notice there are 3 different panels: the door panel, the window panel, and the regular wall panel with no door or window. For your fairy house, you'll want to use 1 door panel, and for the rest of the panels, you can choose any mix of the window or wall panels. All 3 panels are the same size, so it's up to you which one you want to use. Technically, you could even do a house with all door panels if you wanted. Also notice the red dotted lines on each panel. These should be cut as dotted lines because they are going to be our fold lines. If these lines are showing up as solid lines in your software, make sure to change them to dotted lines for cutting. If you have a cutting machine that can also score, you can change these lines to a solid line for the machine to score. I've heard from customers that the scoring tool is never as good as scoring by hand or cutting dotted lines. This probably depends a lot on the thickness of your paper. Next, you'll see a folder called Leaf Vines, and in here you'll find these 2 leaf vines. These are purely decorative and are not part of the house structure. They can be hot glued onto the house when we're finished. It's completely up to you how you want to decorate your house with these vines, or if you even want to use them at all. And lastly, in your download, you'll see a folder called Fairy House Tissue Shapes. If you open the SVG file in this folder, you'll see this, a group of 3 shapes. These are the templates we'll be using to cut out our tissue paper, so you don't need to cut them out in any particular color. I would recommend cutting them in a cardstock though, because we'll be tracing around them and the heavier weight will make tracing easier. You can either send this file through your cutter and let your machine cut these out for you, or you can use the PDF file and print it out and cut them by hand. The large panel on the left will be used to cover the window and wall panels, and the 2 smaller shapes are for the door panel. Now that we're familiar with the files, let's start building our house. These are the materials you'll need for this project. I'll include some links below for some of these materials. You can also find these links in my blog post on my blog, snowdayblog.com. As I mentioned, you'll also need tissue paper for your fairy house. I'm using white for mine, but you can use any color. The first thing you'll do is cut out the panels for your house. Since we're doing a 6-panel house, I've cut out 6 panels, 1 door panel and a mix of 5 window and wall panels. Next, you can cut out your leaf vines. For this house, I'm using 2 large vines and 2 small vines. And lastly, cut out your 3 tissue shapes. To start, you'll want to trace and cut your tissue shapes. For this house, you'll need 5 of the largest shape and 1 each of the 2 smaller shapes. As for tracing tissue paper, all you need to do is place your template onto the tissue paper and using a pencil, trace around each shape. Just make sure not to press or drag your pencil too hard or you'll rip the tissue. Once you're done the tracing, cut out each shape. Here's a look at how the tissue shapes will fit onto each panel for the house. Here are the 2 smaller shapes for the door panel and then the rest of the shapes on the window and wall panels. Next, we need to fold all our fold lines. Take your door panel and make sure the dotted lines and fold flap are to your right. You want to make sure of this for all your panels, otherwise you won't be able to attach your panels together. So, making sure your fold flaps are to your right, fold away from yourself along the dotted lines. This is called a mountain fold because you're creating a mountain with the fold. If you want, you can flip your panel over to make your folds like I did here, as long as you keep all your folds in the same direction. Now repeat these folds with all your panels. Again, make sure your fold flaps are to the right for all your panels and then fold down and away from you. Once you're done, all your panels should look like this, with all the folds in the same direction. The next thing we're going to do is putting double-sided tape on the side fold flaps. I'm using double-sided tape that has a lining on it, so you can place the tape on the panels and remove the lining later when we assemble the panels. Cut your tape into little strips that will fit onto your fold flaps. Then place your tape strips onto your flaps. Make sure your tape is not wider than the flap. Cover all the side flaps of your panels with tape. For now, we're not going to place any tape on the bottom flaps. Repeat this for all your panels. Every side flap for each panel should be covered in tape. Next, we're going to glue the tissue paper onto each panel. Squeeze a small amount of white glue into a bowl. We are going to start with the door panel first. It's important to make sure that the side you're gluing is the opposite side of where your tape is. Start by brushing glue around the edges of each cutout in your panel. For the door panel, we'll glue the top tissue shape first. When you've covered all the edges with glue, place your tissue paper down. A tip for placing tissue paper is to gently bend your tissue paper to prevent it from being limp. Then line up the top corner and place it down when you have it lined up. Try not to drag your hand across the tissue like I'm doing here because you may rip the tissue. Just slightly dab it to make sure all the surfaces are touching the glue. Now repeat the same steps with the door piece. And now our door panel is done, so we can move on to the other panels. Again, make sure your glue goes on the side that's opposite of the tape. And cover all the edges on your panel. Repeat this with the rest of your panels until you have them all covered in tissue paper. Now we're ready to assemble the panels together. We're going to start with the door panel and we'll be working with the top fold flap. Remove the tape lining from all the pieces of the tape that you've placed on that top flap. Then take the panel that you want next to the door panel. For my house, I'm choosing a window panel and attach it along the tape flap. Line the edge of the top panel up to the dotted line of the bottom panel, but also make sure you line up the little top edges where the diamond-shaped holes are. Press down along the tape to secure the panels together. And from here you repeat this step with the rest of your panels. When you have all your panels attached, remove the tape from the flap on your last panel and attach it to your very first panel, which for my fairy house is the door panel. This part will be a little trickier than the other panels. You just have to get your fingers in behind the panels to help align them. Now we're going to attach the bottom half of the house. Again, starting with the door panel, remove all your tape lining. Then pull the panel next to it down onto the flap, making sure to line the edge with the dotted fold line. Here I find it helpful to tuck these corners together like this, then your panels will magically come together. Now work through the rest of the panels using the same method. Again, tuck the corners together, double check alignment, and press down. When you get to the last panel, like the top half, it'll be a little trickier than the other panels. Use the door to your advantage by opening it up and sticking your hand right through it to get a better grip. Now let's move on and close the bottom panels. You may notice that the bottom panels don't exactly come together perfectly, so we're going to fix that. Once we do the next step, these bottom flaps should come together quite nicely. What we need to do is to cut off the folded flaps of every other panel. It doesn't matter which flaps you cut off, as long as you're cutting off the flaps of every other one of these triangles. So here is the triangle that I'm choosing, and I'm going to cut off both fold flaps. Then we skip the next triangle and cut off the flaps of the triangle after it. And again, skip the next triangle, and the next one should be the last panel that we cut off the flaps from. And now to assemble, we are going to place double-sided tape on all the fold flaps remaining. Once you have all the flaps covered in tape, we are ready to complete the bottom of the house. Starting with any flap, remove the tape lining. Here again, you want to line up the dotted line of one piece to the edge of the next. And to do this, you need to fold these triangles up so that they're perpendicular to the wall panels. They should then line up quite nicely. Press down on them to secure the tape. Now work your way around the whole base. Your last triangle might be a little tricky. Just tuck in the flaps like this and push them through. Then secure them down by getting to the inside of the house through the door. And now we have an assembled house. I designed this house to originally have 6 panels, and that's why the base came together so perfectly. As I mentioned earlier, if you want to make a house with any more than 6 panels, you'll end up with a hole in your base. But you can make a 5, 4, or 3 panel house with no issues. Their bases won't come together quite as perfectly, but let me show you how to do each of them. Here is a house with 5 panels. For this house, you need to cut off all the fold flaps of the bottom triangles. And your base will look like this. This one is a little tricky because the triangles won't come together as nicely as the 6-paneled house. So what you'll do is try to create a pentagon as best as you can and get those triangle points to come together in the center of the house. Then, when you think you have a fairly even pentagon, hold down the center. Now, instead of taping these flaps together, it's easier if you just use glue. Glue each triangle flap together at their points like this, at the same time holding on to them to keep that pentagon shape. Notice I'm peeling back each triangle and gluing them on one at a time. And when you've glued on your last triangle, you're done. Now let's do a 4-panel house. Like the 5-panel house, we need to cut off the fold flaps of all the base triangles. This base is pretty straightforward. It's going to be a square. So all you need to do is glue those triangles together to form a square base. Press to secure together and you're done. And finally, let's take a look at how to complete the base for a 3-panel house. Again, we're going to cut off the flaps of all the triangles. And this one is quite easy because the triangles should perfectly overlap. So now all you need to do is glue or tape those triangles together. I'm going to use tape for mine. And your 3-paneled house is done. Now that we've looked at the different house sizes, let's finish off our original house by adding the leaf vines. If you take a look at the top of your house, you'll notice all the diamond holes. If you want to hang your fairy house, make sure when you decorate your house to leave 2 holes opposite each other open for your string to go through. So here I'm just going to place a little bit of hot glue. Then just attach a leaf vine. I'm using the large leaf vine. And to secure it down, I'm just going to glue the last leaf onto the house. You can bend the leaf vine a little to have it protrude. And you can just work your way around the house, gluing on vines wherever you want them. And you can curl some of the vines with your fingers. Now you can attach some string if you want to hang your fairy house. Loop your string through 2 holes that are opposite to each other. Then when you tie your knots, use a finger to create a loop. This will do 2 things. It'll prevent your knot from possibly ripping into your paper, which will also help your house to hang straight. If you're using monofilament like me, you can tie 3 knots for a secure hold. To tighten your knot, you'll need to pull on all the strings. Trim off any excess string. And that's it, your fairy house is finished. I hope you enjoyed this one. If you'd like to see more projects from me, please subscribe below. You can also follow me on Instagram and Pinterest at Chaiv Design. Thank you for all your support.